Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
And me, Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Blair Austin was born in Michigan. A former prison librarian, he's a graduate of the Helen Zell Writers Program at the University of Michigan, where he won Hopwood Awards for fiction and essay. He lives in Massachusetts. Dioramas is his first novel. It won the Dzanc Prize for fiction in 2021. Welcome to the podcast, Blair.
Thanks for having me.
So Dioramas has pretty interesting subject matter. Were you interested in taxidermy and dioramas before you started to write the book? And what drew you to the diorama as the method your Society of the Future uses to preserve all of its history?
You know, for me, probably like all kids, you go to a museum, in a school outing, and are blown away by dioramas. And for me, in terms of taxidermy, family members being from the Midwest, there's a kind of a hunting culture, and a lot of family members would have, different taxidermy on the wall. That was never my thing, personally. I'm more of a bird watcher type of guy. So the strange thing about dioramas, the idea came to me all at once as an old man speaking out of the dark. So he was sort of a fussy man, and he was very much alone. So I get somewhat choked up thinking about it. But his voice came to me, and what's strange was he was speaking about a diorama, but he was doing it as if he had been like window 400. So this diorama came to me, but it was a diorama about dioramas. So immediately I knew that this was a culture that, for whatever reason, had run the gamut of these dioramas. And here they were, dioramas referring to themselves. And the diorama of the taxidermist was this first diorama that came to me. And it was sort of fun, and he was speaking with an arch voice, almost more with Britishisms than with a flatter American English. And I was simply listening to him. What the job became was tracking back to the previous 400 dioramas and to figure out, well, I wonder why he's speaking of this, and I wonder what it's all about. The interesting thing for me, though, is with his voice, all of a sudden the entire city came into being. So I knew where I was. I didn't necessarily understand it, but I knew that we were far in the future, and this was a culture I didn't understand. And the only thing I'd say extra about dioramas is they're similar to the white whale. They're a blank symbol, so you can project many things onto them. The reader will, one hopes. You can project many things onto them, and they will almost ad infinitum allow that. They're still static things, and yet all of this pretend life inside is burgeoning forth, but not. And that was the contradiction that I could not seem to get over. Simple, you'd think, but when you begin to dig into it, at least spiritually, it's quite heavy duty for simple minds.
The novel is set far into the future, yet all the technology and some of the settings feel early to mid 20th century. Why did you choose that ambiance? Does it feel timeless or something else?
Yeah, you know how we build our cultures on the cultures that came before us. And the great irony that I realized as I was writing was that their city, 4,000 years in the future, and you begin to wonder what's left over. Their city was built on ours, what they could find from us. And they were beginning to make some of the same mistakes that we had made. And that was the guiding principle for me. So fascination with literature, dioramas also being books, dioramas being all of these places where we spend metaphysical space, whether it's video games, books, the surface of a phone, any of those types of things fit really nicely into this notion of a surface and what's behind the surface. And as far as I would say I would track back to my own, idiosyncratic fascination with certain types of literature. What is the place? What is the setting where you can revisit those places in literature? For me, it would be the Victorians, and it would be modernism with its outrageous prose, and in particular Juna Barnes, where you have the carnivalesque and this great pain at the center of her novel Nightwood. So I wanted somehow to inhabit or spend time in that place, and so I found myself in a green city, a city essentially in a forest, where they'd figured out some aspect of the city. And there were horses and carriages, but also strange technologies built, automata and things like that, walking around, that would track with what we do here, except imagine it all built by the Amish out of wood.
Going back to the dioramas just for a second, they're more than a type of museum exhibit in this book. They play a role in the writings and death of one of your characters, the great thinker Michaux. And you're talking about what weird and wonderful things that happen in the city. So the city mixes mechanical animals in the natural world, diorama style. And they also appear in ordinary homes. So how would you describe the importance or role of dioramas in Wiggins' world, in this whole milieu?
From the outside, as in a judgmental sense, it's an obsession. We all have cultural obsessions, and this culture has an obsession with dioramas. I wouldn't point to any specific reason for that, but when you're dealing with a blank symbol, you get a lot for free, because the reader will begin to project things onto that symbol. And so I wouldn't go so far as to be able to explain why or the wherefore, except that why was the shopping mall a great thing? What was any desperate cultural artifact? Why did it come to be? For our purposes, and there's a link between obviously our world and the world that's being spoken about in dioramas, but for our purposes, that sense of the imperiled world, and the necessity that we have through books, again, video games, movies, television shows, to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars to recreate worlds. And it's gone completely off the charts. And it's just what we do. It's not as if we're going to change that. So I'm not saying, oh, we need to change this. I'm simply saying that for this culture, imagine if they put their energies into something as bizarre as the diorama. And of course, it reflects back on our own world.
The whole scene also has a strong sense of a vanishing world, as you talk about imperiled, and that tension between the real and the unreal, and that mood that goes through the novel. How hard was it to create that? Was that part of what came to you naturally, or did you work at that particular mood?
It's in the air, for one thing. But the other side is, I guess what I experienced was a storm of language, as if I were in a house in the middle of the dark plain and a storm of language was going by. And my ability to hear that language seems to have been built on, zip codes, what I've read, the folks with whom I've come into contact throughout my entire life, but especially literature. And so that determined what I could hear of this language. And the difficulty was I would sometimes obtrude, and I'd get in the way. And Wiggins was trying to speak, but I thought it would be awfully damn clever to come up with such and such or thus and so. And so I've got hundreds of pages of me getting in the way of this voice. And it's a listening job. At least that's how I conceived of it. And then with this mass of let's say, recorded speech from this man to take the best of what he said, or to take at least something that could be understood of what he said. And that was the game all along.
Wiggins is older and a bit fussy, but passionate about his work. As an artist, he also struggles with obsession over details, perfectionism, and self-doubt. Do you sometimes relate to your work in a similar way, or are your struggles different than Wiggins?
I see some of myself in Wiggins, most certainly. His isolation, for sure. His the absurdities of his obsessions, and I mean absurdities in a gentle way. I mean, we have to be gentle with ourselves at some level. And I mean, as a writer, I'm gonna carry around my neurosis for sure. And so it was fun in some grim way, but also gentle to experience his. Well, his ineptitude, because as you know, he himself tries, after he's been a scholar all of his life, he himself tries his hand at dioramas once he's been forcibly retired. And just for folks listening, he's forcibly retired and placed into a giant apartment block where other people from the Department of Museums who have also been forcibly retired are living. So here he is, and he's got all this time on his hands, and he's awfully lonely, and he turns to the medium itself. He's going to try and do it himself, and he has horrible results. And I think for me personally, I mean, I'm no spring chicken, and so I've had my share of let's say dioramas that failed. In other words, books that failed, or stories that failed, poems that failed, even entire plans of attack that failed, aesthetic delusions that thankfully failed. And so I can relate to him in that sense. And I think that we all tend to root, even though he's fussy and you kind of want to smack him sometimes, we can always relate to someone who tries and fails. It's a human thing. And I wanted, at first it was a game for me. He was a hermeneutician. He looked at things in an analytical, or he thought he looked at things in an analytical way. And he wasn't particularly good at that either, but he managed to make a career of it. And and here he is, failing over and over again. And I think that we do too.
He has interesting companions in his loneliness. So there's some scenes that center on pigeons, and Wiggins also has a relationship with a one-eyed pigeon. What does she mean to Wiggins? And do the pigeons have sort of a symbolic role in the book?
Absolutely. They're the passenger pigeon in particular is the one-eyed pigeon, who is also morphing back and forth among these interlaced worlds between being a carrier pigeon, a rock pigeon, and a passenger pigeon. And that urban world of the rock pigeon and the non-urban world of the passenger pigeon, who's of course gone from our world, interested me a lot. The passenger pigeon did make it up into Michigan. Normally you see maps of its range, and it's going to be in the Appalachian Mountains on up into Massachusetts, Maine. But it had a quite a wide run there for a while, and it did some nesting in Michigan. And just as the grayling, the fish, the grayling that comes up in the book, that became extinct in Michigan. So I was thinking in those terms, and in broader terms. But I don't know if you know this, but there's a what would you call it, burgeoning plan to bring back the passenger pigeon, and there are other plans to bring back, Putin wants to bring back the woolly mammoth, and send it out onto the plains of Siberia. And so there are these beautiful but absurd projects, because meanwhile here we are continually destroying what's here now, but we do also want to bring back what came before. And the strangeness of the plan to bring back the passenger pigeon, I guess I'd like to share with you briefly. You can look it up on YouTube briefly. You bring back the genes slowly using I think rock pigeons, but there might be another pigeon that I'm not aware of. So you basically map onto to an existing pigeon, and eventually over many crosses you get a passenger pigeon. And from there, you have to build breeding stock, and you have to make sure that there's diversity. And you ask yourself, well, where does this DNA come from? Well, it comes from the diorama. It comes from passenger pigeons that are taxidermy, they're either displayed, or usually they're in a drawer, and you see the eye slits, and there's the cotton. You can see the cotton wool behind the eye slits. And so you take that DNA and you begin to build this new world. The same thing is going on with the another species, but a tree that it's not extinct, but it was killed off by a blight from Asia, from the Asian chestnut, the American chestnut, huge tree. And the passenger pigeon ate these things, ate these chestnuts. And so real quick, they're planning on taking rock pigeons, so the average city pigeon, painting it to look like a passenger pigeon, training it to fly between the food sources that they're hoping to create in Appalachia. And then so you release these passenger pigeons, and how are they going to know where the food is? Well, the rock pigeons have been trained to home in on these places. But the idea that they're painted so that they won't look strange to these passenger pigeons, they'll see themselves in the mirror, so to speak, fascinated me completely. And so when you have this pigeon that is a rock pigeon in the book, and also a passenger pigeon, I was thinking in those terms the whole way through.
A lot of thinking going on here. That brings us to the diorama of the town. Okay, so this was it kind of dominates the second half of the book. It was created by Minister Gall, who used it to disappear and then display his political enemies, which is a bit macabre. So later it was closed to the public out of respect for the dead. But by the time Wiggins visits, some people actually want to be preserved there, and they consider it even a kind of progress. How do you as the author understand or view this change of viewpoint in those characters? What do you think it says about them or the world?
The history of the 20th century is, hanging over the diorama of the town, in particular Holocaust denial. So when you have people who, well, the diorama of the town is hundreds of miles across, and there's just millions of people in it. So when you have a shift like that, the sense that what used to be a horror is now something not only acceptable, but also desirable. And then there are sets of mythology, that the sense that it's beautiful, mapped onto this formerly horrific thing. Then you can start to see the economy that might be built up from that. Folks who want to be buried there, they want to be turned into characters. They can be whomever they wish to be. They could be a dairyman, they could be a repairman, they can be anything they want, essentially, in death, and placed in this town. And the tensions there is what I was I don't want to say interested in. That's grim, but playing with is also a horrible way to put it. Dealing with, maybe. Looking at, for sure. There's no answer. But among partisans who believe in the town as some sort of beautiful thing that we ought to return to, and who don't see that world for what it really is. I mean, we can see that in our own cultures now, and with the rise of right-wing extremism and so on and so forth. And those are the echoes that they come as a person's reading, in particular the diorama of the town.
Do you feel as though Wiggins grows or changes as a character? And if so, how? How does he see the world differently after visiting diorama of the town?
As a writer, and I mean, other writers will be interested in this, it's tricky. We're always taught, we need to, something has to change. So we want the character. This is a novel, after all. I mean, for heaven's sake, across 300 and some pages, we're going to have the same guy. So I wouldn't say he changes necessarily, but he comes to an understanding, in single moments, an understanding that he can't grasp. It would be similar to seeing a sunset. And in that moment, you see it, you seem to understand, and then it's gone. So he is continually up against his own death. He's continually up against the diorama as a metaphysical space, as an absurdity. He has some wry things to say about the diorama, and yet he's very much invested. He really does believe in it, but he senses at the back of things that this is. I wouldn't know how to characterize what he senses at the back of things, but you can feel him sensing it as you're reading, and I think that's really what I wanted. Was for the reader to go along on his emotional and psychic journey without necessarily being able to put their finger on it. Because I think in this case, if you lay it all out, suddenly it's stuck in space. And again, you have the diorama as that blank symbol. I want readers to project onto it. That can be a cop out, but in this case, it's not, because he really does go on a journey, and he is changed in a brief moment with a character who is essentially the docent who takes him through the diorama of the town. But there's a horrible irony at the center of that. He sees for a brief moment how it could be possible for someone to believe in the diorama of the town, but he can do nothing with that information as a human being, other than to know it in that moment, and then to have it go, to have it be gone. As a matter of fact, later to reject it. So he does change, but I'll be doggone if I can put my finger on how.
Well, that's quite a journey. And what is next on your writing journey? What are you writing now? Are you writing anything, working on another project now?
Oh, I did the thing they always tell you to do. You finish a novel, and by God, you sit down and write another one. And I did that twice. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily. A case of burnout came. However, the thing that I'm working on now is one of those two. It's called Syphilis, Please. It's set in the same city, but in a city kind of gone off the rails. Parts of the city that have gone off the rails, and the logic of a broken mind is at the center of this city. And I would say that I'm well on the way. I began it long ago, and the question becomes, is it possible as a writer to connect back up with the person you were many years ago? And how much is going to be left? Do you destroy the thing in working on it again, or do you never work on it again and never risk destroying it? I'd rather try. And so that's what I'm working on now. Syphilis, Please. I was working on it in Michigan, or at Michigan, University of Michigan, and my poor peers had to read it as my thesis. And I feel bad for them. They were very kind, and they helped me along, but for heaven's sake, it was an experiment. I'm one of those folks who perhaps unwisely went to an MFA quite late in life. And I decided I was simply going to use the time. I was going to use that time to experiment. And it was a fully funded program. And I had nothing to lose. So I began writing in that same milieu of is it Victorian, is it modern, and that kind of thing. And Syphilis, Please is what came out of it. So I will continue with that. Barring that, I will work on a detective novel set in a truck stop, which is completely different. A kind of in the realist mode. And I believe in all writing under the sun. So there's no contradiction there for me personally. But we'll see.
Well, we are looking forward to see what the next thing that you complete is. They both sound fascinating. So would you like to read a bit from Dioramas for our audience, please?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'll read two fairly short standalone dioramas. And hopefully I don't get choked up. That's just one of those things. I tend to read while snorkeling. I don't know, who knows why, but we'll pretend it's a cross to bear, and we'll all get through it if it happens. The first one's called Spawning. The fast-moving current, about the size of a billiard table, clear and cold, holds the grayling frozen in time. The resin we look through has been carefully pulled when warm to achieve the ridges and the knife edges. The bottom stones are blue like the backs of the fish, dark blue, side by side in their slenderness, jostling. One is bent at the middle in the act of shivering up the stream, and the feeling is that this individual is fatigued, though this is likely wrong. Grayling may spawn many times, going 100 miles sometimes, as we've come to regret in a city when the cold creeks are full of them, smelling of time, hence the scientific name, Thymalus arcticus. Multiple generations, spawning in muscular darkness, swaying in the resin as you walk past. Michaux writes of a fishing trip he took deep in the city, where at the inlet to the Black Lake, deep in the woods, he slid open the grayling stomachs to find 2 pygmy shrews and a paste of mosquitoes, quote, wet and sleeping, unquote. Pebbles go up to stones on the top shore of the creek, white stones. Red alder cones from last year hang over the water. Their stems originate out of sight on the other side of the resin, and mosquitoes rest upside down on the new leaves. Tine warblers, their orange caps, light in the shadow. They had gone extinct here. During the spawning festival, in celebration of the return of the fish from their beginnings in the diorama, some people still wear a sprig of thyme over the course of the day and use it in dishes that evening. This river picks up later in another diorama. Mosquitoes. In one of the little dioramas, scores of mosquitoes float above a water surface. They are drab as they fly, hesitating, drifting like fragile hair-like filings brushed from a machine. Michaux has attached each mosquito to a separate sheet of the thinnest glass, and then, working from back to front, inserted them in the box so that they float, interfiled madly close. Multiple planes, each with its mosquito in the twilight murk. Near the shore of the pond, under the water, the mosquitoes have just hatched. You see them riding toward the skin. Their brown bodies pop through the meniscus to stand on the surface. For the first time in their lives, they ride the sticky water. The breezes touch them. The buildings rise. On their tops are square ponds. As you might guess, the first impulse of the mosquito is to try to return, to try to go back into the water where they were born. But they are too slight to break the meniscus. They can't go back down, and so they stand a while on their 6 legs, each with its little ball joint, like the stem of some articulating lamp, and seem to be thinking about things, to be arranging a pattern. A decision is about to be made, but they hesitate to take it. They've never known the air. For them, the decision creeps like an eternity. That is the scene before us in this 2-by-2 foot enclosure. And yet, something in the mosquitoes is changing. Some impulse flutters their wings. The dust under the water is a bygone eminence. They lift from the surface and take to the air.
Blair Austin, thank you very much for joining us and sharing the world of dioramas with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Be well.
Now we're going to hear from an author who joined us in the early days of the podcast, Ben van Dongen. Born in Windsor, Ben spent many years thinking about writing and becoming an author without doing any of the actual work. Eventually, he figured he should give it a try, and after more time being bad at writing, according to Ben, he managed to write some books he's proud of. Today, we'll hear from his latest sci-fi novella, the 5th in the Synthetic Albatross series. Here's a little bit about the new book titled Snow from a Distant Sky. Barbaric factions, sentient shadows, frozen wastelands, and cold fierce enough to end a world. Thomas wasn't ready for any of it. Led to a portal at his high school basketball court by a trinket given to him by his world-traveling uncle, Thomas found himself on a dying world that looks too much like his own for comfort. In an attempt to find a way home and survive the icy temperatures, he journeys across the snow-covered land, making friends and enemies whether he wants to or not. What's a kid to do when he holds the only ticket out of certain annihilation, especially when finding a way out is a lot harder than stumbling his way in? Now, let's hear Ben reading from Snow from a Distant Sky.
Snow from a Distant Sky, Chapter 2, A Shadow. Hesitantly, Thomas looked down at the body at his feet. The naked man who he had taken the robe from was motionless. His skin looked bluish. Squinting, Thomas tried to adjust to the dim light in the snow-blanketed glade. He thought it was getting darker, as if the sun were setting, but the world he came from was in mid-afternoon. "Have you given up looking for me?" the voice asked. As he stared into the nearby tree line, a shadow fell over him. The growing warmth from the robe slipped away. Thomas looked up, expecting to see a large black bird or some other terrifying creature, but there was just the shadow. It hung in the air above him, an indistinct shape with hazy boundaries like a shimmering portal. Retreating from the amorphous darkness, Thomas tripped on a body and fell to the ground with a crunch. The snow softened the impact, but the layer of ice on top of it left jagged edges around the hole. The shadow followed as if it were tethered to him. "I didn't do this," Thomas said, looking at the body. "I know that." The words seemed to form inside his head. It was like he was thinking them, but they were foreign. "I did it." Thomas glanced at the naked man. "Yes, it was on his behalf, though now he is dead, as are my obligations." Thomas stared at the shadow and angled his head towards where he'd entered the clearing, but the hood of the cloak cut off his peripheral vision. "Looking for a way out?" the shadow asked. Nodding, Thomas scooted back, carving a trench in the snow. The shadow stuck with him. "I am not dangerous, though I am capable of destruction." "I want to go home." Thomas blurted out the words and felt like a child for saying them. He thought about his parents and how long it would take before they realized he was missing. "As do we all. I'm afraid the doorway you entered was fleeting and is gone. It is the way of these things. The chances that you had even run into one were insurmountable." The shadow made a sound like cold laughter. "You are unlikely to stumble across another in your lifetime, even with that curious item around your neck." At the mention of the necklace, Thomas pulled it out from under his shirt. The spot where the yellow gem had sat against his skin was numb. The dark metal chain was freezing in his hand. He stared at the rectangular jewel. It caught the fading light and looked like it was glowing. "Yes," the shadow said. "A marvelous item. May I ask, from where did you get it?" Thomas swallowed. "My uncle, he gave it to me for my birthday." "And he found it in your world?" "I think so." Thomas gripped the chain tightly, his hand to his chest. "Do not worry, I have no reason to take it from you, but there are some who would. It is a rare item, valuable in the right hands." Sitting upright, Thomas leaned towards the shadow, but it kept the same distance from him. "Can I use it to get home?"
That was Ben Van Dongen reading from Snow from a Distant Sky, Book 5 in his science fiction series, The Synthetic Albatross. Currently, the book is available at Biblioasis, or you can order it online.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.